My name is Maura Spiegel. For those of you who are joining for the first time, Narrative Medicine Rounds are hosted by the Division of Narrative Medicine and the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics at Columbia University, Irving Medical Center. The Division of Narrative Medicine fortifies clinical practice by training practitioners to recognize, interpret, and glean insights relevant to patient care and clinician performance by way of the study of humanities, arts, and creative work. Before we begin tonight, I've been asked to mention a few basic Zoom ground rules to ensure the program goes smoothly. Please keep your microphone muted to cut down on background noise during the program. We are going to lock the meeting in a few minutes for security reasons. If you leave the meeting or your connection is broken after we lock the meeting, you will, alas, not be able to return. However, in a day or two, you will receive an email with a link to the recording of the event, so you'll be able to watch it in its entirety at that time. In the unlikely event that we have a Zoom intrusion, we will terminate the event right away, and you will get a new link in your inbox to a new session as quickly as we can administer one. During the talk, we won't be monitoring questions, so please save your questions to type into the chat when we get to the Q&A. Okay, so let's get started. I'd like to welcome our three speakers or interlocutors, beginning with Dr. Mindy Fullilove, who will speak tonight about her recent book, Main Street, How a City's Heart Connects Us All. Dr. Fullilove is a social psychiatrist and professor of urban policy and health at the New School. Since 1986, she has conducted research on AIDS and other epidemics of poor communities, with a special interest in the relationship between the collapse of communities and the decline of health. She is the author of many books, including most recently, Urban Alchemy, Restoring Joy in America's Sorted Out Cities, and with Hannah Cooper, From Enforcers to Guardians, a public health primer on ending police violence. Her many books and articles are eagerly followed internationally by architects, urban planners, community organizers, public health experts, race theorists, and narrativists. Andy Merrifield is a writer, urbanist, and independent scholar with a PhD from the University of Oxford. He is the author of a dozen books, including works on urbanism and social theory, such as Metro Marxism, The New Urban Question, Magical Marxism, and The Wisdom of Donkeys. His latest book, Marx, Dead and Alive, was published in November with Monthly Review Press. Peter Walsh graduated from Marist College with a BA degree in history. He attended the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, and after his service with the United States Army, received a diploma in Anglo-Irish literature at Trinity College in Dublin. For over 35 years, Peter owned Coogan's restaurant in Washington Heights with David Hunt and Tess McDade, a place loved and cherished by the community. This past year, Coogan's closed, but with the help of Facebook, United Way of New York City, and donations, it continues to be a resource helping small business and nonprofit organizations through the Coogan's Community Fund. Tonight's discussion invites us to think about our collective health and where we find ourselves in this moment. Let's welcome Mindy Fullilove.
Well, thanks, Maura. Thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen and just give a sort of little background. And then what I'm going to do is read a little bit from the book, and then we'll get into this conversation. And I'm a social psychiatrist, and social psychiatry is concerned with how larger social systems affect health. Early on in my residency, this was a paper very important to me by George Engel on the clinical applications of the biopsychosocial model, was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. And it makes the case that the sort of the community, family, two-person, that these larger systems are very important to the person. So while certainly biomedicine is focused on the things that are happening internal to the person, there's other things that are important that we have to understand if actually we're really going to heal people. And so this is the focus of biomedicine, But my focus has been up here in this sort of two-person family community systems. And so one of the foundational concepts of social psychiatry is that as we look at these larger systems of community, we can identify the degree to which they are integrated or disintegrated. And this is crucial because integrated social systems are capable of doing work. And one of the most important pieces of work that integrated social systems can do is problem solving. Whereas at the other end of disintegration, you have small fractured networks that actually really don't like each other and people who are only concerned for themselves. In this situation, you have higher rates of illness and social pathology, and illness is much more difficult to manage. So having integrated social systems is an ideal towards which social psychiatry would suggest we strive. I was working in inner city American communities like Harlem. And in the early 90s, when there was a great deal of, uh, of things going on, sort of a series of epidemics, the crack epidemic, the AIDS epidemic, uh, violence epidemic, all at the same time, we talked to a lot of people in the neighborhood. And what we realized was that, in fact, they had the neighborhoods like Harlem and the South Bronx had actually fallen apart from having been much closer to the end of the spectrum characterized by integration and moved towards the other end, the disintegrated part of the spectrum, which in technical terms is called a collection. And this collapse was stepwise, and each downward step was triggered by policies of federal, state, and local governments that undermine communities. We have 4 on this model that we made: urban renewal, deindustrialization, plant shrinkage, and gentrification. But there are many others that contributed to this over time. What I want to really point to today, I think is tremendously important, is that we made this model actually in 1993. We said that what you would arrive at is a state of nonsense in which what was going on made no sense. And I think we were looking at this in inner city minority neighborhoods. So the idea that you would see a whole nation that had been driven towards the collection and where what was going on was really felt like nonsense, that it just didn't make any sense, was something we could sort of vaguely imagine, but I don't know that we ever thought we'd actually see this. Part of what holds a community together is the built environment. This is an illustration from a very famous book called American Building. James Marston Fitch, the author, was on the faculty of Columbia. And what he points out in this illustration is that the building is doing work for the person. And when we set buildings in configurations with each other, which is sort of how we build our cities, then the set of buildings start to do work. And when you tear the buildings apart, then you create this downward spiral. This is a photograph from Pittsburgh's Hill District, which was destroyed by urban renewal. And it's a neighborhood I had a lot of opportunity to visit and study. It's the focus of my book, Root Shock. So this has horrific effects on the social world of the people when you destroy the set of buildings that make their world. So looking in a slightly different way at this issue of the built environment, I proposed this question: what is Main Street doing to create mental health? And so sort of how is the set of buildings that we call Main Street working for us? And just in summary, I just want to, this photo is from my hometown, Orange, New Jersey, taken by one of my high school classmates, of a celebration. And people are on a parade on Orange Main Street, which is still to this day a beautiful, fabulous Main Street. And so what Main Street does is that the storefronts, which are facing each other, create enclosure. It creates a space. People use that space to make society. The sidewalks and streets are public space, which is very important to what can go on there. The stores and the other buildings offer goods and services people need. People see what's cool, like hairdos and outfits and cars. So this is a cool car. These are cool girls. They have cool haircuts. At least on that day when this photo was taken, it was all cool. And the street goes somewhere, and so do we. So Main Street is making huge contributions to allowing us to have a crossroads, a place to be together, and to learn about each other and to get to know each other. Very, very important to building society and building an integrated society. The idea in an integrated society is that we share sentiments. If we see a flag, we would feel proud. And so the idea that there's one flag that makes us all feel proud is a very, very fundamental part of an integrated society. And conversely, if there are a lot of flags and some of them make us feel afraid and some of them make us feel terrified and ashamed, we don't have an integrated society anymore. So I'd like to, because, narrative medicine and all of us who've been at Columbia are so closely connected to the story of Coogan's, which is a story I tell in the book. It seemed just perfect to read a little bit about Coogan's, and so delighted that Peter Walsh is here to talk to us. Peter Walsh is one of my teachers. What does a Main Street do? I could always go to Peter and say, could you tell me about fill in the blank? And he would. So from the book, I'm going to read this section about the story of Coogan's. If we are serious about justice on the one hand and making it through the upheavals caused by climate change on the other, we have to fight for our main streets. On Wednesday, January 10th, 2018, I read in my morning paper that Coogan's, a restaurant pub in northern Manhattan, was to close. I had worked for 26 years at New York State Psychiatric Institute, and during all that time, Coogan's was an anchor of my life. Located on Broadway at West 169th Street, it was a welcoming place and real in the best sense of the word. When city connoisseur Phil Hallen would visit from Pittsburgh, he'd say, let's go to Coogan's, that place has soul. It was the site of many special events, among them the promotion party for Bob Fullilove, when he became the first African-American man to be made full professor in the School of Public Health at Columbia University. His photo is one of dozens that hang on the walls in Coogan's, celebrating the life of the neighborhood. When I first arrived in Washington Heights in 1990, Coogan's was a unique Main Street spot in a neighborhood that was leading the city in drug-related violence. My offices several blocks away were opposite the biggest drug dealer in Washington Heights, and my walk to the office was accompanied by the crunch of little plastic vials in which crack cocaine was sold. Coogan's was part of turning that situation around. It was a place that welcomed the working people of the neighborhood, African-American, Hispanic, and white. People of all ethnic backgrounds were the hosts, waiters, and bartenders there. Coogan's went beyond that, opening its doors for every celebration, joyous or sad, that was going on in the neighborhood. They sponsored a 5K blues salsa shamrock run through the neighborhood, helping reclaim it from violence. They always supported Hike the Heights, our annual parks event. When my students were raising money for Coach Dave Crenshaw's Dreamers Project, they talked to Coogan's and got the back room for our event. Though I had moved downtown to the new school in 2016, the news of the closing hit me hard, and the reason made me mad. Jim Dyer reported, Coogan's will be closing this spring for the usual horrible reasons, the end of a lease and impossible rent demands for a new one. Its space is owned by the neighborhood's dominant institution, New York Presbyterian Hospital, which once was delighted to have any legitimate business running in a neighborhood that was a headquarters of the city's drug trade and its collateral murders. Now, in more peaceful and prosperous times, the hospital's leadership has emptied out nearly an entire block of commercial real estate along Upper Broadway. I started calling and emailing all my friends. The news was rippling, literally, through the world. Lin-Manuel Miranda, author of the musical Hamilton, tweeted that the restaurant is one of the true Washington Heights mainstays and has embraced every wave of neighborhood change. I love Coogan's. My stomach hurts from this news. I signed an online petition from change.org, which quickly garnered 15,000 signatures. and learned about a demonstration to be held on Sunday. Emails were flying back and forth when the news broke that the hospital had backed down and Coogan's was saved. Bob got the backstory from co-owner Dave Hunt, who told him they'd been in negotiations with the hospital for 3 years. The hospital's representative said it was his mandate to get the highest possible commercial rent. Dave warned him there would be blowback when the news came out and asked if they were prepared. "You might pay $400,000 in public relations fees," he told the man. The representative laughed. "You may be right, but that's not my department." Dave and fellow owners Tess O'Connor McDade and Peter Walsh put their heads together to prepare to close in May. They knew the New York Times was doing a story. When they realized it would be posted online on Tuesday, January 9th, they hurriedly called the staff together. Dave recalled what transpired then. "We have about 40 people who work for us. There's a lot of families that depend on this income, a lot of students who go to school, and they depend on this income, right? But every single one, 100%, said they would stay with us till the end. They wouldn't jump ship and say, 'Oh, I have an opportunity now.' By the same token, we called some people in the restaurant industry and said, 'Listen, at the end of May, we're out. I'm going to bring you 2 guys in my hands,' I said. 'Will you take them?' Every single person said, 'If they work for you, we'll make a spot for them immediately.' So everybody was taken care of. Now I'm thinking I better make sure they get at least a week or 2 off. But everybody in the restaurant industry was right on. And all our employees 100% said, 'We're there until the end. We'll work until the very end.' That night, when the Times posted the story, all hell broke loose. Coogan's was getting phone calls from around the world. Dave told Bob, a woman from Colombia was in here and said that her daughter was in Kenya and emailed her saying, 'What is this I hear about Coogan's closing?' The following night, Wednesday, local political leaders gathered at Coogan's to form a task force. On Friday morning, Congressman Adriano Espaillat and Luis Miranda, Lin-Manuel's father, had a meeting with the CIO of New York Presbyterian Hospital. The congressman called Dave after the meeting and said, 'They told me they would revise their thinking and make you an offer that you can live with.' Dave said, so 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 guys from the real estate department came over and a very, very simple change to the lease terms with a small rate increase on an annual basis that we could handle. And we were able to sign it, and it took 28 minutes of negotiation at that point to make the deal. The 15,000 signatures on the petition collected in 48 hours alerted the hospital that they had stepped in a hornet's nest. Dave reflected, "We knew we would be missed by people. We knew that people would be disappointed. But I have to tell you, the love that came out of this community was incredible." Bob asked what he thought made people so passionate about the place. Dave responded, "Tess, Peter, and I treat everybody who walks in the door like a friend. You're going to have to work at it not to be welcome here." One of the people that made a beautiful, beautiful Facebook posting was an African-American bishop, Darren Ferguson, who we have known, well, let's put it this way. We've known Darren since before religion was on the agenda. I said I was so impressed and so heartwarmed by the outreach from the African-American community to Coogan's. I hope in the future we'll continue to earn the respect and love of the Black community. He came back at me, "You've already done that." That's Coogan's. So glad Peter's here, and I'm going to share a video that Peter made. As many of you know, and maybe all of you know, Coogan's closed early in the pandemic, not from the hospital, but from the pandemic. And so Peter made this video that we're going to show you. And I have to share my screen correctly.
Coogan's is closing in 4 months and is
catered to so many, including the staffs of New York Presbyterian Hospital and Columbia Medical Center.
In a 1985 Washington neighborhood known for its rich tapestry of life.
Columbia Medical Center closed its doors back on the 17th of March because of the pandemic. At the time,
Mr. Peter Walsh. Peter. Hi. Welcome to Washington Heights.
they felt comfortable. It's what we did with Coogan's. You felt safe, and if you were safe, you could be joyful. And if you were joyful, then you could really go on with the dream that you had.
And that's what made it so hard to make the decision to close, because those 46 employees that were fed from Coogan's, they each had their own story.
Basically, when I started working there, it was like I was just home. I was getting paid to be me.
It was a weird thing, like, you know, are we going to reopen? The bar is lonely, and the chairs and tables are wondering when the key's going to turn to unlock the magic again. Well, I'm going to figure something out. I'm 73 years old. I've never not worked in my life. Coogan's is a spirit that has to go on. We have to keep our communities together. That's how we get through this. My father used to always say, always be a moving target, young man. Always be a moving target.
Hopefully shutting that down means it won't continue to keep playing the next video. And so glad Peter's here. And Peter, one of the things that I came to talk to you about and get your, like to try to understand was, how is it that a restaurant like Coogan's, an independent restaurant, is so much more powerfully an anchor of Main Street than a chain restaurant? Peter, I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Okay, forgive me. If you went to a chain and asked them to donate money to a little league, they would say, we have to check with headquarters. And they would give you an address and you would mail to headquarters. And if you heard an answer, it would be months. So that's the first thing. But we're a newspaper in a sense. We are the oral news. Any small business is the first local news that you will hear. And it's more than asking about just what the weather is. You feel the pulse of a neighborhood from individually owned stores rather than chains. Chains are more national in their mentality, and they're not representing the neighborhood. They're there to take out of a neighborhood, send the money somewhere else where the money is going to have nothing to do with the neighborhood. And the American neighborhood, and as you write about Main Street, is in danger of disintegrating for many reasons. But one of them is chains and losing the whole concept. Look, if you don't mind, if you look at, and Andy, if you looked at an English pub or the Irish pub, when you came in to that pub, you found out everything that was going on. You found out the prices of oats, what a cow or a pig would sell for. You would find out who was getting ready for marriage, and who was a young man and a young girl who would maybe meet, and then maybe a fiddle player would start playing a fiddle, and maybe you would find out where the British soldiers were blocking the bridge. But it gave you the heat of a fire. Maybe you were down on your luck and you didn't have warmth in the thatched room that you lived in. So it became a home, and that tradition of the Irish pub is spread throughout the world, and it's something that David and Tess and myself are very brought up in and conscious or unconscious of. So that translated through us to what we were doing when we opened Coogan's. So a chain could never do that. A chain becomes, it's like having a farm, it's like being occupied. You know, they're there, they give you whatever service that they're there for. And then, as I said, they take the money and they fly. So that's part of it. And the other part, again, about what's going on right now, the lack of leadership in our cities. And what a momentous time this is to be talking, because we're the revolution going on in the national government and the new president, it's so important. But what's going on in the city, the reinvention of the city has to take place, and it has to take place preserving what Main Street was and still can be. And that has to be by, let alone racial integration or creed integration, but economic integration. I was brought up in Catholic schools. And I remember saying this to a priest one day. I said, do you think Catholic schools or religious schools in general are part of the problem of segregation in our society? That we were kept from mixing with other people of other religions and basically other races, because we were both, in my case, we were both Irish and Italian and whatever Catholic ethnics there were. And I looked and I said, maybe that was part of separating us, that religion became a very negative thing in that part of it. So Coogan's, we didn't have a religion. Coogan's, there were no tribes. You walked in and you became part of us. It was something we didn't care about you or where you were from until we hugged you. You know, our hug was a handshake. We weren't embarrassed about giving hugs to everybody. And we were made by our customers. The neighborhood made us who we were. They told us their needs. We were an art gallery. We were the first theater that reopened in the 70s. There was no theater in Washington Heights. Our waiters put together a theater company. We had poetry readings. We had poets all over the neighborhood, and they were great. You could come in, there'd be rap poetry, there'd be classical poetry, there'd be Shakespearean style to Robert Frost style poetry, and it mingled. Once every 2 weeks, we had an art exhibit, and you know, we did everything on the house. It was wine, you know, we gave away, and the cheese and the fruit, but it was a way of us meeting the artists of the neighborhood. So it was fun. Part of the Coogan's thing was having fun with the neighborhood. You won't see that with a chain. A chain's not going to do that. You know, we didn't look at the bottom number every day. We didn't have to. We owned the place. We looked at let's have fun while we're working. I can take this a lot further. You know, I'm not short with words, but in case you want to interrupt with a question, you can, Mindy.
A related question. Is there one thing, because I think Coogan's was so important in helping to tame the violence in the neighborhood. Is there one among the many things you did that you think was the biggest contributor to that?
I think when the riots went on, a lot of places put wooden sheets on their windows, plywood and all that. What we did was we stayed open, and we stayed open 24 hours. And then in one room, you would have all the cops eating. And then in the other room, we had all the protesters. And I think one of the most interesting things one time was Guillermo Linares was the first Dominican elected to the city council. And I pulled him out of the room and I said, Guillermo, come here with me for a second. I'm going to introduce you to Nick Estevilla. He's the precinct commander of the 3-4 precinct. And they both were very hesitant about meeting each other. Maybe it was like, this was not a photograph. Either of them wanted to go into the newspapers, but they sat down. And I think that was one of the most important things that ever happened there, because shortly after the riots ceased, or the disturbances, some people called it. But I think it was important that happened. And our community policing changed from that. And Washington Heights was so far ahead of the entire nation. When you see what was going on in the nation, we were so far ahead of the nation in certain things that started being done with what they call CPOPs or C-cops. And it was a way where the police had to learn about the neighborhood. The police are always considered foreigners. That was an Irish neighborhood at one time that became a Dominican neighborhood. Most of the cops weren't Dominican at that time. Our baseball league was coached by all policemen. It was named after a murdered policeman, Michael Busick. All the coaches were cops. All the kids were Dominican. And out of that league, almost 50 kids became policemen. And I remember Mr. Busick, Michael's father, the cop who had been killed, he started that league. And rather than, with vengeance on his mind or hating people, he came back to do something and with forgiveness and decency in his heart. And, when you saw like what happened in Charleston, South Carolina, what happened in that church, you saw authentic forgiveness. And forgiveness is such a difficult place. It's such a difficult thing for people to do. And when I saw that forgiveness by this man and to see what came out of it, it was just inspiration to all of us and to everyone, I think, in the neighborhood. So those were things that happened inside of Coogan's that I was able to watch and feel part of all the time. And it was inspiring all the time. I used to love coming home and telling my kids, I said, kids, when you come home, you don't walk past drug dealers who are calling you over, not just to sell drugs, but to work for them and put money that you would make more money than your father and mother were making when they were coming home from their jobs. I said, these kids are heroic. Every day they are heroic because of what they have to pass, go by, and then come home. So Coogan's became a safety valve. We were a place you came in, and I think you saw that in the ad. By the way, that's the first time I've watched that ad with other people and listened to your words, Mindy, and I'm humbled. I really am. But we became number one, safety. If you were safe, you could have joy. If you were safe and joy, you could have an edifying experience in life. And that was something that we wanted to celebrate, and we did celebrate. I used to love when people who were going to the hospital, they would open the door to Coogan's and they just were not used to an integrated bar. And they would look up and see Dominicans and Blacks and Caribbean, African Americans. And you could see them like saying, oh my gosh, they were a little scared, and then we come, can we get you a table? And we bring them in. It was back in the 80s and all that. That was unusual. And that was, we felt very good about showing that, displaying that. And then when you mentioned about the race, it was a way of taking the streets back from drug dealers, of saying, let's run right where they sell drugs. And that was an important thing. And all the medals on the kids were put on by either firemen or policemen. And that was very important to me, to cause some type of bonding. For a lot of these kids, it was the first time they were that close to a cop, and their parents were watching. And that was the first time their parents ever would let them be close to a cop and or any type of authority. So bonding people at a very early age was important, and creating trust. Nobody wins a political argument. I'm not here to convince anybody to what I believe in, because it's frustrating. But what you can always do is plant seeds for decency. And planting seeds for decency, especially now with what we've been watching for the past 4 years, and what we're watching with our country, and where I'm coming from, Coogan's, and from that perspective of watching an American dream that still goes on in a wonderful way. always being reinvented, always being creative. It's not, smooth. It's not smooth. And I think there's a documentary coming out soon. And one of the things I said, forget about the melting pot. The melting pot is BS. We're a TV dinner. It's a TV dinner. The peas are here, the steak is here, the gravy's here, the salad's here. And the thing is, we mixed it up. It was like Polish here, whites are here, blacks are here. And we just wanted to take the TV dinner and mix it all up. And we were good at that. And our best friends and mentors were all Dominicans and African Americans. Charlie Rangel and Denny Farrell were our angels, and they were our mentors. And it was wonderful to have those relationships, and they were intimate. We were intimate. I often ask people when they're talking about the problems between race problems, I always say, well, how many people of the another race have you had to your apartment for dinner? How many have I been in your house? And it kind of stops them for a moment. And I remember my mother we never had parties in our house or dinners in our house because she was afraid my cousins would steal all the ashtrays. She says, oh, we're not having them over. If they'll take the ashtrays, they will. Oh, no. We'll meet them at a bar. They're not coming to my house. But, it was always a funny, we're looking at that. But that was, we were brought up in bars. The Irish were brought up in bars. And it's funny when I see the divisiveness of the Irish, the great liberals that the Irish can be, and then the arch conservatives they can be. It's an amazing dichotomy that they all come from the same place, and yet some forget what they came from, and I don't know. Some are very unhappy, and they think that their dream has been stolen, and they blame other people for that. And it's a very, it's not who they elected, it's why they did what they did. Was it a great venting? It wasn't this guy, but what's in their soul and hearts? What was going on in their neighborhood? What was going on in their Main Street? Were they able to go down Main Street anymore? Were they scared? People became frightened of Main Street. A lot of it, I'm not going down there. And all of a sudden, where's Main Street? And empty stores. We would tell the hospital of the stores they own, we would ask them to say, listen, these stores are empty. Can't you give it to an artist, light the windows up at night and let some art be in the window? So instead of someone shooting up or smoking crack, people will walk by, they see some light, and it brightens up the world. And that's important to me, to see those in the changing of what Main Street has to be, that there should be nothing like a window with a for sale or shuttered, that it should be. It was very sad when I saw Coogan's all shuttered with those shutters. I wish they had given it to artists, at least, while they're deciding what to do with it. And I don't think they're going to have a very difficult time doing that with anybody. I mean, there's a difference between security and safety. A bank, it looks very secure. You walk into a bank, they want you to feel it's secure. That's part of their deal. But it has nothing to do with safety. Safety is something that's so precious. It's when you can say, I'm holding the hand of my 5-year-old kid, and I'm going down a street to get something from a shop. Safety is when an elderly woman is able to still get out of a house and go to the bodega and buy something and have a chat with her neighbors. That's the safety of Main Street. That's the safety of the neighborhood. It's Main Street, but it's the side streets that lead to Main Street. And the darkness that pervades now the city with empty stores is destroying that. Again,
it's such an important lesson, Peter, that what you did at Coogan's is how we make the nation safe. I wanted to I know you said to Andy, he may remember from English pubs and Irish pubs. I got to visit with Andy. Andy it was like 2 years ago, whatever. And we went to a tea shop. Yeah, it was a tea shop. We had cream tea. Andy, you want to join in and some thoughts about cream tea and that helps make Main?
Well, I was just very struck listening to Peter and just hearing his narrative. But in terms of Ulysses, and I know Peter will know Ulysses very well. Leopold Bloom, his parents, his father was a Hungarian Jew, fictitious of course, but let's think about it, who emigrated to Ireland, to Dublin. But just imagine if the father of Leopold Bloom had emigrated to New York, which probably would have been more likely in a sense. And Leopold Bloom was walking up Upper Broadway in Washington Heights. I think he probably would have passed by some of the other bars, because you remember later on in Ulysses, Peter, when Leopold Bloom meets the Citizen later on in the afternoon in the Cyclops, and the Citizen is an ultra-conservative, anti-Semite nationalist, and he's taunting Bloom with all kinds of anti-Semitic remarks. And of course, Bloom responds, reminding him that that Mendelssohn was Jewish, Karl Marx was Jewish, etc., etc. Spinoza was Jewish, I think was his other one. But early in the day, he had had lunch in a pub that I know you know, which is Davy Burns in Dublin, and he has a gorgonzola sandwich with a glass of Burgundy, and he's looking around in a place which is very homely, very warm, very welcoming. It isn't full of bigots. It isn't full of raving nationalists. It's what Leopold Bloom calls a moral pub. And just hearing you talk, it would have been kind of nice to, somebody should rewrite the peregrinations of Leopold Bloom on Upper Broadway, coming into Coogan's, having his gorgonzola sandwich with a glass of Burgundy. One of the characters there was also a guy called Nosy Flynn.
Nosy Flynn. Yeah.
I love the name Nosy Flynn.
Yeah.
And what that reminds me about is the banter, and what you were saying was, it reminds me of the narrative in Jane Jacobs as well. When Jane Jacobs in The Death and Life of Great American Cities is talking about the public character. Do you remember that in the book, Mindy? And Jane Jacobs talks about public characters.
Absolutely.
Public characters were deli owners. There was a guy called Joe Cornichia, I think he was, who owned a deli store along Hudson Street. And the other public characters were bar owners, and it just strikes me as that idea of the public character as somebody who melds together the sidewalk and the bar and the public and the private. People come from the public realm into the private sphere, but it is sort of still public, and it's the public characters transmit information about what's going on in the hood, and they kind of keep it together in a way which is unimaginable in TJ Fridays or something like that.
Right.
And I just think that it was beautifully evoked in terms of just how you described it, that you could see Leopold Bloom, just there in a very hospitable place, and a moral pub. I love that term. I don't know what it means. People ask Joyce, what did he mean by moral pub? Of course, he didn't give a good answer. It's up to us to kind of get it, isn't it? And I think if you think about it, we can get it, what a moral pub might be, and who might be drinking and talking and meeting and being welcomed in a moral pub, and how that is the gel that keeps things together. It's the narrative that it all holds together in that way.
Andy, you're saying something very special, because it's amazing. And if you look at the Joyce where you bring up Joyce, Joyce as Stephen Dedalus, I'm going to create the uncreated soul of the conscience of my race. He has to go to Paris finally at the end to write. He goes to a foreign country.
Yes.
And why does he do that? And Coogan's became like our own country in a sense, because you were allowed to be an artist where he wasn't going to be suffocated by the culture. Culture is a wonderful thing to celebrate until it fears other cultures and smothers the artistic concepts that we all have in our soul. And so you always have this war going on between culture and art. Some people want to preserve the culture, and it should be preserved in its wonderfulness, but not at the expense of art, because art will explore into the culture. And if you look at the Irish music, say, and watch the traditional Irish music, how it's now being combined in indie music with African and Cuban sounds, you know, where you've watched all that wonderfulness that Day Dannon and Chieftains, and you watch how the music mixes. It's funny. And we worked on that, doing something like that. And I used to love having discussions with people musically about taking music, but creating something else from it, and not just living upon living upon a culture can also be like getting the dole, like living on welfare. You know, if you're not have the aspiration to take it to be an artist, then we're all artists in ourselves. And again, I think that's part of the beauty of Coogan's. Coogan's was full of wonderful artists, and not just the ones who painted, but the ones who lived their lives. You know, they were creating something. You know, Dominicans were always creating wonderful things. Musically, they were creating things, but they were creating something in their literature and even in their language, the way they spoke. There was always something going on. And then you have Harlem next door. You know, I mean, this is it. You're telling me the vibrancy. You know, we had a breakfast every morning on St. Patty's Day. It was hosted by a Jewish doctor. And I remember a New York Times reporter was in, and he said, what goes on here? And I said, well, in a Catholic-owned bar in a Dominican neighborhood next door to Harlem, we have a Jewish doctor recite from a Protestant poet, Yeats, and that's what America is all about. And the guy was writing down. He says, "Can you say that again?" I said, "Nope, I can't, baby. You got it once. It just came out of my mouth." But that's what it was. It
Can
was
I ask a question?
Yeah.
Related to that, Peter. One of the things that you did was put photos on the wall. So Bob Fullilove, when we had the party there, when he got to be professor, we took a photo and you put it on the wall. And I this had a lot of meaning to me, you know, and to our whole group, because we were on the wall at Coogan's.
Yeah.
I wonder, Andy and Peter, what you think about that kind of reflecting back in court. Somehow you made us all part of the family, and there's so many photos. I just wonder if you have thoughts about that part of your art.
Can I say something?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Do you remember the movie Do the Right Thing, the Spike Lee movie from the late 80s?
Oh, yeah, sure.
You remember when it was Boogin Out was in Sal's famous pizzeria,
Sal,
and he's looking around, and he's eating his pizza, and he's looking around, and he's looking on the wall. You know, Al Pacino, Frank Sinatra, you know, they're all Italians, and Boogin Out said, "Hey, Sal, you know, get some brothers on the wall, motherfucker," he says, you know. and Sal wasn't too happy about that. He said, "This is an Italian pizzeria." And he said, "I know, but look at who's eating." And it was all African American. And I think that was, for me, that was a tremendous moment in the movie, which I love, I have to say. Yeah. But you know, having you mentioned that Bob was on there, the first African American full professor at Columbia Medical School. So it's I bet there's brothers on the wall and sisters as well there, isn't there? I guess, and I think that is quite significant in terms of I don't know, back to this moral pub again. I guess it seems right.
It was important, Andy, that everything that we hung in Coogan's had to do with our customers. You know, there was no stock photos. There was nothing. Everything came from the experience of people being there. All the pictures were people, if they were still alive, they drank there. And if they weren't alive, they had drunk there. And it had to do with Coogan's. It was the family, you know, and it became, I miss, at some time, I think I miss the fun of talking, especially to the young kids up at the bar. I mean, they were funny. They were vibrant, and you know, they were clacks and clicks. But you want to know something? It wasn't a clack or a click that would stop you from ever being part of their conversation. It was wide open. You know, there was a wide openness to the place. You didn't feel like you were violating somebody's private party. So, and the pictures did that, and we didn't know. We did. Listen, we weren't saying, "Oh, this is what we're going to do. This is a plan." It just happened. We wanted to put these up because we liked it. It was a way of filling in empty spaces. And if you're going to fill in empty spaces, fill it in with the people who fill your heart and your soul. And we know we could touch them. You know, I mean, every picture and anything, I could tell you a story about the person in that picture. I could walk around and literally there were thousands. I don't know how we fit them on the wall. Somebody said to me, goes, boy, you got a lot of pictures of yourself up there. And I said, well, that's why I bought a bar. My wife doesn't allow me to hang pictures of myself at home. You know, but I would always have, you know, take photographs with the famous and the infamous and the not famous, but they were important to me. They were important to me. And people would sometimes come up and go, will you put a picture up of my friend? And I said, sure, bring it in. We put it up. You know, it was important. It's important that people identify with a place. They need an institution. They need familiarity. Familiarity is something that's just being ripped out of our lives all the time. Mindy, you've done that, you know, in everything you do. It's about all these familiar places ripped out of our lives. I mean, I'm not talking about things dissipating. I'm talking about things torn. I mean, you know, if it's dissipating or if it's just a gradual environmental thing, that's one thing. But if it's torn down, like buildings are ripped down and the city's ripped down, and it's vicious. It's a vicious thing that takes place, and it's powerful people who make those decisions who have nothing to do, or nothing to do with what that piece of earth was they tore down. They have no idea. Those poor guys from the real estate office, who, you know, wanted to maximize their profit for New York Presbyterian Hospital. I understood that. These are business. I understood it. But what I didn't understand about them was they didn't appreciate the history of the neighborhood. They didn't know what they were outsiders to me. They were foreigners. They could have been someone from another country coming in, as far as I was concerned. We called them suits. You know, they all had more expensive suits than the usual administrators uptown. You knew them downtown right away because the suit was worth about $800 more. And someone saw me one day, and, you know, they saw me with a jacket, and I had to go to a meeting with these guys. They said, what are you doing? I go, well, I have to go suit somebody. And, you know, I put my jacket on and a tie for them. And after a while, I said, the heck with these people. I'm not going to be nice to them anymore. So I wasn't. Every time we would have meetings with them, I wasn't like begging. I didn't. I just said, you don't know what you're doing, and go ahead and, you know, do what you want. But if you expect me to be, you know, thanking you, you're not going to get that from me. And then I would throw them out of the restaurant for the day. And I said, you mind leaving? I'm too busy right now. And I didn't care about them. And I knew they weren't going to, it was like trickle down economy. You know, the Reagan years, a trickle down. The only thing that trickles down is piss, you know. And these guys were standing on a table, and they wanted me to thank them for pissing on me. Excuse my language. And they weren't going to get that. So,
jumping in to say that we would love to entertain questions if you have questions for any of our speakers. And there's one here, rather complicated question, a very powerful question. You might want to look at it, everybody. But fundamentally, the question is really responding to what you've just been talking about, Peter. You know, how do you think we can change this narrative about who's bringing ugliness? That is, you know, is it the people who are needy and homeless? Who's bringing the real ugliness into the city? To change the rhetoric around who the bad guys are, in a sense, who destroys a neighborhood. I think I understand it that way.
Well, you know, it's you said homeless. I think that the homeless is just misused and overused because nobody knows how to talk about what makes up homeless. And it has to be diagnosed. It has to, I mean, there are people who need 24-hour care, and it costs a lot of money. So the city just calls them homeless. Well, they are homeless, but they're psychologically in need, and they need little villages and a different approach to how to make them happy. What they do is I call it sleeping and sweeping. They let them sleep, and then they sweep them out onto a neighborhood where the first thing they want to do is go get their drugs, you know, depending what time of the month it is when they get their money. And I used to watch it all the time, and I'm saying, they don't deserve this. And the neighborhood doesn't deserve this. I go, where's the care go? Well, you know, Creedmoor at one time had farms. I don't know how they were operated, but I talked with Jim Dwyer from the Times about it. And I said, why don't they build little villages where they have little business? And as these guys get better, they become the person who sells you the cup of coffee. And it's a training village almost to get back into society. I mean, the crack age, what they did was amazing. And Mindy and all you out there who are social scientists and scientists know that the old Governor Cuomo, when he closed down a lot of the centers, didn't have a plan. He just turned everybody in the street, and Koch was the mayor, and Koch says, well, I'm not going to spend money on these people. So it developed from indifference. And so how do you solve a problem if you don't diagnose it? And that's what you guys are. You diagnose problems. And the homeless thing is the biggest BS going on. I mean, how many, when you divide it and you look at, you know, I think it was 32,000 when I looked, and now it's what, you know, 60,000. But how many a woman, how many individual women, how many children, how many men who are drug addicted, how many men with psychological problems? These things, they just, and the bureaucracy, there's a lot of money being made by people just sleeping in places and then getting rid of them and throwing them back on the street. I mean, that upsets me. That upsets me because we all have to, it takes safety away from their lives, because among what happens to them, when you go into one of these shelters, now in the old days, back in the 80s, when the Armory had, what, 1,200 men living there, it was like a picture out of World War II. It was like someone described it as something out of Gone with the Wind, the railroad stations of Atlanta when it was down. And what we were doing, it was, if we watched it as a movie, we would say, who could be that horrible? Well, we are. The answer is we are. We're that horrible. And we're not taking care of our own people. You know, I like a whole type of Marshall Plan just based on taking care of Americans in need, our own domestic, and we're being shortchanged a lot, and it's a very ugly thing to me. I don't know if I answered the question, but that's how I feel.
There's another question from Mario de la Cruz. As a long-term resident of Washington Heights, I'd like to ask a question about the composition of a city and the way residents might be characterized as dangerous versus disenfranchised, and the obligations of inclusion during periods of renewal or gentrification. It's kind of a related question.
Sure. Maura, could I add just a quick sentence into that? Thank you so much. No, thank you for reading the question. I grew up on 169th Street between Broadway and Fort Washington. I know Coogan's very well. And I remember, as Mindy was pointing out, the small plastic vials, sometimes with red tops, sometimes with green tops, sometimes yellow tops, depending on where you found them. But I think it's important in that history. And I think Savannah's question spoke a little bit more about our present concepts of what we should do about the homeless, which is a beautiful question. I think my question was more about the history or the narrative that we tell of these neighborhoods. And if we only characterize that time period of those people as dangerous, is there a way in which perhaps we're mislabeling or missing out on describing, in fact, that being disenfranchised in and of itself told a different part of that story? I remember very clearly coming out of the train station on 168th Street, and there were particular homeless people that we saw all the time that were there. And if my mother was carrying some packages, they would help us walk to 169th Street to be able to bring those bags home. In the same way that perhaps there were also persons struggling with mental health issues that really needed assistance that could have been dangerous. But there was a balance between those things, and perhaps for the people that lived and grew up in those neighborhoods, there was a different concept of what dangerous was versus disenfranchised. And so I was just curious if either Peter or Mindy could share a little bit about both the history and the narrative of speaking about people in a particular way, and how that influences how we might see the city develop as it becomes renewed or as it becomes gentrified, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm happy. Thanks so much, Mario, for that question and for the thought. And yeah, I do remember the people used to see all the time. So the sort of the part of the neighborhood that lived on the street as opposed to. But, and there were many things about it. I mean, having the highest murder rate in the city, I would say is dangerous. And it was traumatizing to people. So in that way, I would say it was dangerous. But there was another weird thing because it wasn't cared for in the normal way. I used to park my car. My office was on 166th between Audubon and Amsterdam. And I would park my car there, that a lot that's now one of the hospital buildings. And there was a fire hydrant that was leaking. And the fire hydrant, it just, when nobody came and took care of it. And there was a very severe winter. And so I would have to walk to my office on like 5 feet of ice. And it was terrifying. And that was dangerous. So now, so I think that there were things that were dangerous, but it then, as you point out, really becomes ascribed to everybody who lives or works or moves in the neighborhood. And so the fact that it's dangerous, the fire hydrant that's leaking is dangerous because the city didn't take care of it. The city doesn't get blamed, it's the people who get blamed. And, to me, one of the things about Coogan's was that it was welcoming, the food was good, it was beautiful, it was delightful. And that becomes that counter. And there are many ways in which you could see that counter, the sort of coffee carts or people selling vegetables on the street. There are so many assertions of beauty that tried to fight against it. But when something's been labeled bad or dangerous, it's devalued. And then people come in, the people who want to rip things down, and they get to buy it at bargain basement prices and push the poor out. So it works very viciously. Andy, you have some thoughts about that?
Just in terms, yeah. Not really, Mindy. Let's take some other questions. I don't want to hog any space. You guys are talking in a particular, and I don't want to bring it too much into the general. Take some other questions.
Okay. So here's a question from Karen Schmidt. The pandemic has done untold damage, but one positive has been some reclaiming of the streets of New York with outdoor dining, open streets, etc. Mindy, do you think it's a good thing? And if so, how can we maintain it?
Well, I have to say that I haven't been in New York City exactly once since March 13th. I'm a New Jersey person. So I haven't seen this outdoor dining in New York City. I've seen it in Jersey City. And not so much in the city I live in. So I don't know that I'm an expert on it. And also, I just want to say that one of the things I saw for outdoor dining was little tents. So people would take their family or their pod into the little tent and eat. And then they would come out and another family would go in there. So one wonders, is there something about droplets in the air that you didn't read in the newspaper? Why would you go into an enclosed tent right after some other group went into the enclosed tent? So some of this outdoor dining makes me very nervous. But figuring out how to share the streets, I think is, I'm really for that all the way.
And Mindy, to follow up a little, I've dealt with recently talking to a lot of the restaurant representatives, and they're very angry. And it's because if you looked at the federal budget plans, there was not $1 for small business in the package. It was not $1. I mean, big companies were getting money that didn't even deserve it, but nobody was doing anything for small businesses. And you're going to see another 20 to 30% of the restaurants and bars that are open will be closing. Because the ones that are open, very few are making any money. And very few even breaking even. They're trying to hold on, but the problem that they have now is they're going into debt every day. When we closed, and you close a restaurant fast. You don't screw around. You say, okay, boom, boom, doesn't add up. We're bleeding blood we don't have. Close the place. And that was like Coogan's. We've been in the business long enough. Now you're going to have people who own businesses who've been trying to hang on. They're going to start losing their own houses. They're going to go into greater debt. And then when they do get to start back in business, as I said, they're going to have to pay off all these debts, all these debts, which are going to suffocate them in a sense. So it's again, part of what I say, the reinvention of cities. You know, if you want to really have a real estater, give him a heart attack, just bring up commercial rent control. You know, you want to see him fall on his face and start crying, you know, just say that. And have you seen the city or the state start even thinking about this? The lack of leadership in our country for the past years and in the city. I mean, in a sense, the mayor has united left and right and middle and moderate because everyone dislikes him and nobody knows what he's doing. But where's policy? And there's no policy. You know, look how fragile the food delivery came just from the fields, of growing them on fields. And then putting with truck drivers, by the way. And truck drivers, what do when they drive? They spread a flu sometimes. I mean, they're going all over the country. So it became very fragile. And as you know, Dixon Despommier, you know, a good friend of Bobby, and you know him, the father of the vertical farm, you know, where you can grow things in an urban area. And he's completely ignored, except by countries like China and Europe and Holland, and where they listen to him and they take him seriously. But where's our program? Where are to bring together small businessmen, elected officials, and bureaucrats? Now, the bureaucrats are always interested in fining people, and they're going to have to change that mentality when we come out of this pandemic. They're going to have to help people get started again rather than fine them and rationalizing their jobs. And bureaucracy has a very difficult time doing that. They're interested in going and telling you, you're not doing that, you owe $1,000. You're not doing that. And then they rationalize their job. So it has to be a bureaucracy that's helping. And that's going to cause a change of thought, a change of mind. But it has to take place. And there's nothing going on with this. And you're going to see emptier cities, vacuous cities. They're going to become dangerous neighborhoods that weren't. Madison Avenue has this problem now, and so does neighborhoods like Washington Heights. It's now universal throughout the city. It's universal throughout the cities of America.
Perhaps this is a relevant question from Donald Kalish. Maybe there'll be a change of heart here. Many neighborhoods have a dominant institution. In Coogan's neighborhood, New York Presbyterian and Columbia PNS was the two-headed giant. What role is played by these institutions in the lives of the restaurants and other community gathering spots? I mean, is there a chance maybe there'll be a change of heart in how they approach their commercial rentals?
I think real estaters are holding on to their line and their dream. Don't forget, a lot of real estate in the past 25 years was bought at top dollar. And what do you do? It's like these corporations who sell to other corporations. The first thing they do, they did attrition to get the money that they overpaid for what they bought. So you have high mortgages by the realtors. They have to pay that mortgage off. So you have to bring in the whole government process, because it's not just saying rent control for small stores. It's helping the realtor now pay off or pay a mortgage. I mean, it goes down the line. And this is a very complicated problem. And I mean, if I understand it as a bar owner, I hope some elected official gets it and understands the equation, but what has to be brought together. And so you're dealing with such a conundrum right now. It took the pandemic of, was it 1915 when it began, 2 years for restaurants to recover. And there weren't many restaurants at that time throughout America, but it took 24 months. I think it's going to take more so, even though we have more science, we have more social media, it's going to take longer to recover. People are not going out means the saving more money. They have more money than they had before, the ones who have jobs. They're not used to having that kind of money. So how are they going to spend that money? They might be doing with trips, real estate themselves, houses, apartments. So it's going to be hard for restaurants to even maintain the new set of people's habits. Habits are being changed. So one habit is people have more money. Another habit, the developing how to do things now without going out to restaurants and social places. People becoming more introverted. When people become more introverted, They're not sharing in the news of a neighborhood. They're listening to things on the web, which can be completely distorted. I mean, we have over 70 million people in America who have believed some of the most curious stuff on the web. I mean, it has to be and it's a universal thing now, but it's 70 million people inside basements like mine and houses are now, their social life is over a web. So it's a dangerous place. It's who controls the web has a lot, and what they're listening to has a lot to do with this.
Right. A question for Andy about, we were hearing these remarkable, wonderful stories and wondering how you see the role of narrative in this effort to enforce Main Street communities, neighborhoods, and so forth.
That's a good question. To me, in a way, the narrative is always something about how you can somehow join together things which don't seem to be connected. So, you've got things which seem disparate. Yeah, when you get somebody who can tell a good story like Mindy, you see that actually these things we see are, not connected, separated, disconnected, in some way discrete, are actually related, and the whole thing, the whole shebang goes together. So I think like all good narratives, Main Street is pretty much the same. So what you've got in some way like Main Street with Mindy's book, she has a narrative that almost breaks it all apart and then reconstructs it again. And actually breaking it apart is a kind of demystification. What you do when you break it apart, you can see that actually this bit is related. That building does relate to the sidewalk. That back street is integral to the main street. That highway is cutting off the main street. All these little bits and bobs of the cities, which we see as entities and things, are actually processes which are intimately related to each other. So like all the best main streets, the best narratives see this organic whole, and the whole kind of book hangs together just as the whole narrative of Main Street hangs together. All those disparate things are not disparate. They function as in an organic unity. And I think part of the problem is that once they get hacked apart, then the question, the balance and the unity in this organic wholeness somehow begins to break down. And I think, the real problem now, in short, it's almost facile to say it, is that so much of what Mindy's books were talking about were how people encounter other people, how buildings relate to those encounters, how the social and the physical combine. And what we have now is an encounter that actually is being completely ripped apart. It has been ripped apart. It's been ripped out completely. We've had economic distancing for probably since Ronnie Reagan for 30 years. Mm-hmm. Now the whole social distancing is creating a de-encounter. So everything that was once together and organic and whole has been shattered and ripped apart brutally. And through social distancing, which is understandable, but also through just appalling mismanagement, and appalling incompetence, and an appalling misunderstanding of how society, how society functions, in this wholeness. So how things can be stitched back together again is the question. Just one thing Peter said just struck me. I know that for many, many years, the US, I used to live in the US. I spent 5 years living on the Upper West Side. One of the big battles in the 1990s in the US was the living wage movement. And they were trying to pressure any government contract any public contract that an employer had, whether it be servicing an office, whether it be municipal headquarters, IT, would have to pay a living wage. And these were tremendous battles that I remember. I lived in LA, and LA had a big living wage movement. I also spent a lot of time in Baltimore, which had a living wage movement. But nobody actually mentions this weird idea. What would a living rent look like? The small business owners, what would a living rent
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing to see. How would you organize that? Because the living wage were done with the unions, SEIU, HERE in LA. Some of the service sector unions were organizing workers who did have a kind of workplace. You know, it may be at night, you may be Latino, and you may be sweeping out the office space, but at least there was some sense of solidarity and a place where you met. But it strikes me that the small business owners are these disparate disconnects that actually need each other. And what would a living rent look like? How would you begin to even struggle, agitate for a living rent? It's an interesting thing to think about, isn't it?
Well, if it's the last thing I would say, just on this, and it's when you deal with small business, you're dealing with the middle class. We're shrinking. The shrinking middle class and the shrinking small business world are intertwined. And what happens when they shrink, the aspirations of the lower class disappear. So without a middle class, you're stealing the aspirations from the people who are more undernourished. Where do they go? So the separation of the money, Andy, did you ever think when it first said England was a nation of shopkeepers, it was almost said as if it was half an insult and half a compliment. Well, now we realize that a nation of shopkeepers is what makes a nation tick. And the middle class really is the backbone of any society as we know it, as we know it. And it's now disappearing. And you look at the salaries of CEOs, you look at the upper people getting paid ridiculous amounts of money, and it's just disappearing. And you know, I said to one person who was more of a Republican type of frame of reference, and I said, well, if you want to get people in your army, you better start getting, and exactly what he said, you better start lifting the wages of the lower classes and the middle classes. Because no one's joining the army if they have nothing to care about or fight for. You know, that flag, you mentioned it before, Mindy. It's very difficult when you see that American flag, and it's very difficult for a lot of people now to salute it. It always has been. You know, when you go back to the history of the Civil War and what happened afterward and the elections. And that's that flag is supposedly uniting us. And it's used to divide us now. And I have a lot of sadness in that. My family were, you know, people who fought in Okinawa, the Battle of the Bulge. They were Irish immigrants that came over this country. They didn't care about anything except the education of their children. That's all they wanted. That's all they didn't want a bigger car for themselves. They wanted all of us to have an education, like everybody else listening to this right now. And that's being ripped out of the dream, ripped out of the American dream. And that to me, it's scary. I'm sorry.
I feel somehow like this has kind of been a little visit to Coogan's, like this conversation has been so real and wonderful. And now we're kind of run out of time, which I'm sad about too.
Buy another round.
I just want to close by saying that somebody has asked, when are you going to have a exhibit of the photographs from Coogan's? You know, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and especially thank these wonderful speakers. And this discussion has been so real and wonderful. And just to say that links to where you can purchase Mindy's book are shared now. Here we go. And there'll be a recording of tonight's events to be shared later this week via email to all who registered. Again, thank you everybody so much, and wishing everybody some kind of celebration tomorrow as we see
the
page being turned.
Make some noise at 12.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, everybody. It was really lovely. It was fantastic. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Andy. It was beyond my wildest dreams of how great it would be.
Oh, Mindy, thank you so much. I miss you. Andy, I never got the opportunity of really doing some share time, but we're going to meet down the road.
We'll do it. I'll be over there. As soon as I get my jab, I'm over there.
Yeah. I'll bring the whiskey.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good, Peter. I'll hold you to that.
You got it. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, Mindy.
Bye.
Love you.